Hey Tim, I think it's about 15 years ago when you and I met. I think it was in a work tech conference, and I'm just going to say it straight away. I'm very grateful for this world that you've introduced me into. I remember vividly about 10 years ago that we had a chat for a breakfast in London, and that you said to me, Philip, I'm about to go deeper down into, I would say, the real evidence behind what is good workspaces. Would you think there is a space for a tool to actually measure and track these kind of things? And I said, yes, actually, I've just been tasked by my CEO in California to consolidate various workspaces into Europe, and I want to do it the smart way, and that's how we got going. I think I'm very pleased with the work you've done to date, also more recently as we hear. I think for me and for many others, you're not just a mentor, but I'm also going to tap into you as an oracle, maybe going slightly beyond your role as the chief exec and founder of it. So let's get going. First question is, I know it, but many people may not know it. Could you give us a snapshot of what the Leesman Home findings are as they are coming in over the past, I think, 10 months?
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Philip. So look, we've spent since that time, since 2010, measuring the experience that employees have of working from corporate offices. So last, January, February, many of our Asian clients started knocking on our door and saying, hey guys, we're going to need your help doing something slightly different. We think we're going to need to start measuring the employee experience of employees that are going to be grounded at home. So what can you do to help us? And I'll be very frank, initially we said not much. Our specialism, our single focus is on that independent measure of corporate office space in supporting employees. But we pretty quickly realized that COVID and the pandemic was going to be sweeping across the world, not just Asia, and we mobilized, did about 6 months of R&D in about 6 weeks. So our incredible Dr. Peggy Roth and our CTO managed to motivate and mobilize their teams and launched a new home working assessment in March last year, currently sitting on over 160,000 employee responses to that parallel question set. And the really critical decision that Peggy made back then was that the methodology stays exactly the same. So the activities that we understand, how well they're supported for an employee, are exactly the same in our home working study as they are in our office study. So we now have that opportunity to give a really accurate cross-sectional analysis of the ability of a home to support an employee versus directly in a head-to-head fight, the ability of the office to support.
Okay. So a couple of top findings maybe that have come out of that, Tim?
Yeah, sorry, you did ask that in the front of your question, Philip. So key things, so on average, the average home working experience is better than the average office experience. That's the tabloid headline, which doesn't say a lot about the average office. If spaces designed for living can support work better than spaces designed for working. So I think the design industry and clients have got a lot of accountability there in that the legacy product is outdated and homes are supporting employees generally very well. Now, of course, they're answering those questions under the cloud of COVID and under the cloud of economic uncertainty. So one has to sort of bubble wrap slightly their response, but in general, homes are faring pretty well. The interesting thing, which I know you love, and we've talked about this already online and through various chat functions, is that the key thing that the home is supporting brilliantly in comparison to the office is any activity that benefits from acoustic privacy. So you name it, if acoustic privacy benefits the activity, home is better by a long way in most instances. And that's where the design of the future office has got to measure up. It's got to accept that it has wholly failed to understand the impact of acoustic privacy on modern knowledge-based work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then we're all working from home in this session also too. I mean, I know that you're not asking at this very moment whether for people to score the 25 service and physical aspects of the office, but I'm sure that through discussions and so forth that you've been able to indicate where the office typically fails or is inferior. So what are the key things that you feel people are missing? But we all know that most of our dwellings have not been designed for us to work or either study. So, and there can be spaces where acoustics is fine, but there's still a lot of them that are also very poorly. So maybe a quick ranking of the areas that require attention for people working from home.
Yeah, so the key thing is basic ergonomics. So the desk is always ranking as the most important physical feature at home. Wi-Fi connectivity sitting a close second, and then the seating, the chair, in a close third behind that. But actually, I'd like to sort of go up a level actually and remind people that it's not just about worrying about ergonomics, human factors. First of all, we've actually got to examine what spaces people have at home. So between 25 and 35% of employees that we've measured across those 160,000 within an organization do not have a space at home they can designate for work. So that's the first thing. We can't just assume that everybody has an infrastructure that they can adapt, or like you and I, spaces that actually can carve out for a private and fully enclosed space. That is still not the majority. So there are other issues at play here about the ability to be able to open the door and close the door on a day's work when one's working from home. That for almost a third of the working population on average in an organization, that pure benefit is not available. So they're sofa surfing, they're jostling for space on a kitchen table in a shared flat. And we mustn't forget that sort of unheard minority at the moment. Those are where the key challenges are, first and foremost, in actually finding space suitable to repurpose. Those who've repurposed their spaces, or those who already had space, frankly, are faring really well. So we don't have to worry about them. That's my view. And I think, I'm not going to sit on the fence on this. The ones that we need to work on and focus on are those who simply don't have a space at home that they can properly designate or rightfully designate for the purpose of work.
Yeah, so indeed, there is indeed a spectrum of people. There's the people like some of us which have space already and are now further optimizing that. Then there is those which are unfortunate to live in quite tight corners, quote unquote, and therefore will need to get support from government/taxpayers or employers or others, or maybe find a way out to co-working space. And then there is other people which have a propensity to spend and invest in this by their own means, or maybe semi-supported by others. I mean, they all have different kind of journeys to go about. How do you relate to that? Is, in fact, one of the questions has always been there for me. Is there, on this topic of the work home, yeah, where we know that Francis Hollis has written about it, is there blueprints that people can tap into? Is there architects at this very moment which are now embracing this to actually have work homes that address both of these things? I must say I have searched myself, and there's not a lot out there that is ready to leverage. Is that your finding too?
I think it's an area where there is a proliferation of very basic information, and actually here what I'd applaud are the suppliers of those products that enable you to work slightly more effectively at home. So IKEA are doing some great things. They've announced this morning, as an example, they're actually relaunching or globally providing a sort of retrade, a buyback proposition. So any employee who has temporarily repurposed their home, who finds themselves able to go back to work later this year, can take their products back and have them repurchased by IKEA. I think it's those types of moves, and we should look at those types of organizations. Herman Miller are doing some great things. Vitra have done some awesome public webinars. If you look at what those large commercially based sales organizations have done to repurpose their supply chain to be able to get individual products to individual homes, you're going to probably find better advice there than you are from an architectural or a design practice. I haven't seen anything that the RIBA have posted on this. And so I think actually that, when it comes to homes, that's a hard ask, I think, to seek professional guidance, unless you're already at a level, frankly, where you can afford it, and probably where you've already repurposed your space, or you've bought a pod for the end of the garden, all of those types of things that are available to a few people. The masses, I think, are at a different end of the spectrum, are struggling with different aspects. So.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we all know that architects for residential dwellings have already an enormous amount of vantage points that they need to be good at. Anything from sustainability, I would say, energy consumption, not to talk about toys, and I would say home automation, and then to add a new perspective of what is the lens of actually working or studying from home. There isn't a lot of them other than in Instagram-like kind of stories, which have taken the time to appreciate the activities as you guys have been tracking them for a long time and what that means, right? So, but you're right. So the Herman Millers and so forth, these are parties which are strictly speaking B2B companies, and therefore that is new to them. The Vitras and so forth, and the IKEAs, of course, have a consumer leg where they have better direct access to partners that can feel that, of course. Yeah,
I think Herman Miller made a pretty stellar move though, because their new CEO is ex-Gap, right? So actually they put somebody at the top of the business who understands retail better than any of their other competitors right now. So I would watch watch how those large organizations basically are pivoting their supply chains to use them in different ways. I think there's a lot to watch there, and so that can teach us a lot also about how corporate organizations can help get products to their employees at home for those who are making gestures in that direction.
Okay. Interesting. Well, that was a topic that was touched on in the Ask Leesman session, where we had the 4 people from ergonomic and other backgrounds and so forth. Very interesting panel, by the way. One of the topics that came up is that it's not easy for an employer to get really involved in what's happening in the home itself because of practicalities of getting in their privacy and things like that. I think we all know, in fact, some people I talk to are basically saying, well, we're not going to ask that question about whether you're doing fine at home, because they will get it back as a boomerang in terms of funding that's required. Now, we all know that the amount of real estate in offices will go down substantially, whatever the figure is, as we've seen it in experiments which we done in Plantronics, as you will remember, and therefore there is substantial savings to be had that can be hopefully partially reapportioned. Have you seen employers which are a bit more forward-looking and embracing this and basically saying, let's not stick our head in the sand, we're saving a buck here, we could potentially invest that, and by the way, this is the way we're going to go about it? Have you seen them?
There are a number, Philip, that are doing some pretty exciting things, I think, and adventurous things. But they're also just responsible things, right? Actually, that if you consider, to your point about cost, a central London office might cost somewhere between £15,000 and £20,000 per employee to accommodate.
Yep.
You know, it doesn't take a lot of that. A proportional chunk of that contributed to somebody's home work setting could revolutionize the way that they can work from home. So most of the informed, intelligent organizations that we're around at the moment are, if they are not already doing something, are certainly entertaining it. But let's also not, mince our words here. Okay, this is only the UK Health and Safety Executive who've published this. I don't know what other countries are doing, but I assume most of European countries will follow suit. You have a legal obligation. It's very clear. Go and check it out on the HSE website. You have a legal obligation to stay in touch and to understand what your employee is doing at home. So they might not like the idea of asking a question, but they are now legally obliged to ask the question that says, can you effectively, contribute from that remote location that also happens to be your home?
Yeah. Now, again, in business, there's a spectrum of large and so forth. And in fact, the audiences that we are supporting at this moment are also 100+ employee kind of corporations or organizations. But we all know that from a total working population perspective, that the vast majority of people have their employment in small, going into medium kind of companies. And I know that this is not the kind of segment that you typically serve at Leesman, but who should be called upon, who can contribute to get those people into the right mindset framework and help for that? Do you feel that, are you seeing across the world that governments are taking this to their roster of things to do? I mean, for instance, in Belgium, we have more than 1,000 inspectors which are checking whether people are enforcing work from home, which is a sort of stick kind of method. But there is not a lot coming forward in saying what those small employers should be doing to do the right thing in terms of providing a workspace environment. What are you seeing in England and other places?
I think, whilst the sort of typical client for us would be sort of 300 or 400 employees plus. Bear in mind that a number of our clients, even the global clients, have territories or markets where they would have 50 or 30 people working. So we've also got experience of the challenge of operating in those smaller sort of circles. I think it's fair to say even an organization of 100 people would have somebody in the organization who would have had that responsibility and who would have had that interest for the employee in the corporate office. And I think anybody who puts up the defense to say, well, that's just way too complicated for me to now entertain the implication of it at home, is putting up an artificial barrier. I think if you could do it in the office, if you can assess and monitor and be empathetic to somebody's ergonomic environment, the range of spaces you offer them, the sort of hospitality experience, if you like, of coming to the office, then I don't think it's that difficult to extend that to home settings personally. I think it might be a little bit of additional resource, but as you said, resources available right now in terms of financial resource, because the cost of occupancy for most organizations can now be re-geared, not for all, but many of them will be looking at the opportunity to re-gear their costs. And the cost of office corporately is still way more expensive than the cost of equipping somebody at home. So I think it's just a mental repositioning. And if you don't have the organizational capabilities in-house, there are heaps of organizations just at a short arm's length externally that can support those types of initiatives and agendas. So I think it's more of a sort of probably it's a reticence to act, or a sort of a decision paralysis problem rather than a resource problem. The resource, I think, is almost certainly there in an organization who are concerned about it in the office. The resource is there to be concerned about it at home.
Yep. Well, in that Ask Leesman review, it was very clearly pointed out that the people suffering most is the leaders themselves, because their duty and also the mechanics of doing their jobs is disproportionately more difficult than before. So of course, most probably they have no choice but to get their act together themselves in the home working environment, and doing so should be, as a servant leader, willing to pass on the findings or the recommendations to others, right?
Yeah, and I think most of the companies that we're around, and in fact we're doing it ourselves, is to also be very aware of the ongoing learnings. We've just done a Zoom training refresher course for our own team member, because actually what you find is that people lose habits and tricks that you've embedded at the front end of a process, or that the tools change and the access to equipment changes. So actually keeping it constant. This isn't something you do at one point in time and then assume everybody is equipped. Actually, you've got to maintain that discipline all the way through. And as the situation changes, as we long tail out of the pandemic, how that will then change for a workforce at the moment who are very static, they're home-based, or they're perhaps predominantly office-based. We're going to go into an environment where this fluidity, this sort of tidal flow of employees around many different assets that will be available to them is going to make that job even more complicated.
Yeah. So looking at your next update on Leesman Home, which is on the 15th of March, if I recall well.
16th, I think. 15th or 16th. You may be right, I may be right. We'll wait and see.
Yeah. Well, in any case, I think the title that you have there, the banner, the tabloid banner, I think is quite on the mark, where basically you're saying, look, companies, there's one thing you got to remember. If you want to get your people back, if ever in some cases, you better got your act together with something that is truly inviting, standing out, anywhere from supporting the activity to hospitality and so forth, because they're going to vote with their feet. That's basically your message at this moment, right?
Yeah, so the research is absolutely unequivocal in this basis. For those clients who have asked how often somebody would return to the corporate office post-pandemic, once it's safe to do so, out of choice, what would they like to choose? The higher the experience they had in the office pre-pandemic is a direct indicator of the amount of time they want to spend back there post-pandemic. It's the most statistically robust driver of perception for action post-pandemic. Yep. So it's nothing to do with the active, well, it is something to do with their activity profile, it is something to do with the accommodation they have at home, but the strongest driver is the quality of the experience they had before. So the title is, yeah, go big or they'll stay home, because that's what they'll do if you're going to give them the freedom. Frankly, why come back to a substandard space when your space at home is working pretty well? If what you're coming back for is the whole frisson and the collage of what a great workplace offers an employee, then employees want to be back there.
Okay, good. Well, with that, I'll throw it open to the floor for other people to ask you questions. Thank you very much, Tim.
Pleasure as always, Philip.
Pleasure. Over to you, Ben, to direct that.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Philip. So we have had one question. Okay, so the first question that's come in, Tim, is how do you isolate the rigors and frustrations of home working sufficiently to minimize and avoid issues with family relationships and home life?
Yeah, great question. So the core questionnaire for home working and for office working has at the front of it, and you can see a demo version. If you go to leesmanindex.com, right on the middle of the homepage is a link through to a demo questionnaire. So you can, if you like, our methodology is completely open source, but we ask a number of demographic questions that enable us to filter and analyze the influencing factors on somebody's home working experience. So the strongest indicator of whether a home working experience will be positive or negative is not actually about the sort of presence of others or childcare responsibilities. All of those things have been looked at, and they do influence slightly somebody's experience, but nowhere near as big as the magnitude of, frankly, whether they have a designated space or not. That is the principal driver. The second driver is how complex an employee's role is. So the more complex the role, the more difficult it is for them to exist in the singular setting of home. So those are the two factors, and because of the way that we ingest the information, we can always cut and slice to make sure that we're not seeing any trends in those other areas. But good question. So and that the event that Philip referred to, if you look at the events section on the web page, at leesmanindex.com. You can register for that very easily, and those are the types of data points that we'll give a little bit of a refresh on the next data briefing.